Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third day of Genocide Awareness Week 9. We're very pleased that you're here, and every speaker is very pleased you're here because we believe strongly that it is essential to promote awareness and educate as many as possible on historical and contemporary genocides the world over. You are very fortunate to have this conference in which to listen to survivors, activists, authors, academics, and politicians, to name a few, who will speak on crucial events that have impacted and are still impacting the lives of millions. We say never forget and never again, over and over and over. But since the end of World War II, there have been over 100 million deaths due to genocide. So let us take this conference and let's listen, critically think, and then act in order to mitigate and stop mankind's scourge. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stanley Mirvis, who is an assistant professor, Harold and Jean Grossman Chair of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. Dr. Mirvis was also his assistant professor of history at the philosophical and religious studies at ASU as well. He is author of The Jews of the 18th Century Jamaica, a testamentary history of the diaspora in transition, and that came out on Yale University Press in 2020. So we've had in the past a couple of presentations on the Jewish diaspora, particularly to the Philippines and Shanghai, but we've had very, very little on the Caribbean, aside from what happened with the St. Louis and Cuba. But Dr. Mirvis is going to go into that diaspora of the Caribbean. So thank you very, very much for coming, Dr. Mirvis, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate the gracious introduction. Let me share my screen and get over that hurdle first. Okay. Let's see. Okay. This is a new platform for me, so let's try it like this. Okay, Matthew, are we all good here? Can you see my screen and hear my voice? Uh-oh. Oh, Matthew, okay, good. Thumbs up. Yeah, I needed some validation. Okay. All right, good. All right, so I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes to outline the Jewish refugee crisis in the 1930s to about 1933 to 1939. And particularly the ports of refuge in the Caribbean. So I'll talk about some specific places, including Cuba and the Dominican Republic and Jamaica and also Trinidad. So those will be the main areas of my focus. I also want to try to contextualize it a little bit within the context, the general context of the refugee crisis and the start of panic migration after the pogrom in November of 1938, Kristallnacht. So I also will want to draw your attention to the images that I'm going to show, which I have found on the JDC website. So the Joint Distribution Committee maintains an excellent archive, a digital archive that's available to the public. And I really recommend anyone who's interested in this topic and in resettlement of refugees at the time of World War II, to really explore what JDC has to offer, because it's a very vast collection of archival material and images. And my last caveat before I begin is to say that I'm really a researcher of the 18th century. And so this is really a little bit outside of my comfort zone in terms of periodization. I'm starting to generate some more interest in the 20th century, but I'm really just learning as we go. So this is kind of fun because we get to learn together. And when it comes to the questions and answers, I'll do my best to try to address the issues, but I'll also try to lean on you and lean on those who have more expertise than I do in this particular topic, which I'm sure is many of you. So just to say that, and redeem myself of any possible error by saying that I'm really an expert in the 18th century. Okay, so let's move forward. This image right here that you're seeing is a Jewish refugee from Vienna in Cuba. And I just thought that this image really captured the whole story very well. So first, let's just talk about the general refugee crisis and to get a sense of what is the context here. There's an estimated, refugees are very hard to count, but it's an estimated around 300,000 Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria between 1933 and 1938, with the start of panic migration. And then once the war begins in 1939, there is a steep decline in the number of refugees. The doors are closed, the war begins. So it's really, when you're talking about refugees, I think we're really focused on this period between 1933 and 1939. In 1938, in November of 1938, there was a major pogrom throughout Germany, Kristallnacht. This was promoted by the leadership of the Reich from top down. It resulted in destruction of Jewish property, but also in a refugee crisis of its own, where many people were displaced and put into camps as a result of this pogrom in 1938. So the world watching this event realizes that there has to be something done. Maybe there has to be a joint decision of what is going to be done with the onslaught of refugees that are going to be pouring out of German lands. So the United States calls for a conference in the resort town of Evian in France. There they establish there's about 32 delegates that come from around the world. And they have a nice time and they enjoy the nice resort, and they debate the issue of who is going to take refugees. Now, the United States doesn't want to take refugees because, the doors had been closed since 1924 and earlier since 1921, when they established caps on immigration based on the population that was already there. So in 1924 reduced the quota of Jewish refugees that can be taken in, or Jewish immigrants that can be taken in, based on a percentage of what the community that was already established in the Americas and in the United States. So really, nobody was willing to lift the very strong immigration prohibitions throughout the world. At Evian Conference. The real success of the Evian Conference is establishing an intergovernmental committee on refugees, the ICR, which supposedly was meant to apply pressure to Germany, was meant to try to keep tabs on what the refugee crisis looked like. And so I don't know how successful this was in trying to mitigate the experiences of refugees, but it was at least a gesture and a nod to the reality that this was a major crisis, and the expectation that it was only going to get worse. Now so now you've got thousands of Jewish refugees who are displaced from Germany and Austria, and the two senators from Massachusetts and forget where the other one's from, but two senators you probably know more than I do, bring a bill before Congress to allow for a lift in the quota. So an increase in how many Jews, especially children, can be accepted into the United States. This is the so-called Wagner-Rogers bill, and it is defeated by the isolationist, anti-immigrant part of the United States Senate. So there was an effort in the United States to try to at least allow for more children into the borders. Now at this point, the war has started in earnest, and the Holocaust has begun. And by the Holocaust, I mean the industrial extermination of the Jewish people that resulted in in the death of 1/3 of all Jews on earth. So and this was no secret to anybody on earth. Everybody knew what was happening in Poland at the death camps. And so this results in the Bermuda Conference, which is a much more crisis-driven conference with knowledge of what is happening in Poland at the death camps, to try to reassess the what is the ability of the world to help and alleviate the pressure on Jewish communities, not only refugees but also those that are in Poland. And it was heralded as a great success by the New York Times, but Jewish groups felt sidelined, and it felt very disappointed in the result. And that was similar to AVN conference. And the AVN conference, Golda Meir was there representing the Mandate Palestine, and she didn't get to speak. The JDC representatives were there, and they didn't get to speak. So Jewish aid organizations and Jewish advocacy groups, including the leadership of Mandate Palestine, were really sidelined in the discussions. And the same was true at the Bermuda Conference. So, at the time, Chaim Weizmann even commented how much of a failure it was. And this was in stark contrast to the way it was being celebrated by the press in the United States as being this wonderful success, that there's a softening of the hearts of the world to bring in refugees. So the Joint Distribution Committee, which had this known as the Joint, was established after World War I, so it had already been in place to deal with refugees. But over the course of the refugee crisis in 1933 to 1938, the JDC really shifts its focus towards specifically German migration. And there's other groups in the United States that are more focused on the Eastern European migration. The American Jewish Congress has a keen interest in trying to situate displaced Jews from Eastern Europe. The American Jewish Committee similarly is focused on German migration. There's a disagreement between the American Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Committee about what is the best response of the Jews in America to what is happening in Europe. With one group, the American Jewish Committee, the more German group, trying to advocate for a policy of slow pressure on Germany, whereas the American Jewish Congress, the Eastern European Advocacy Group, really wants to effect a complete boycott and take a much more aggressive posture in censuring Germany. And in this context, the Joint Distribution Committee really has a global reach. They are the central location in which the funds are being raised from American donors in order to support refugees. And they succeed, as John alluded to earlier, they succeed in settling refugees in Shanghai, in Japan, in Australia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Uruguay, and of course in the Caribbean as well, which is what we'll be talking about today. And by way of transition into the Caribbean, let me also return to the AVN conference for just a moment. Because in 1938, at the AVN conference, there was one country that fully embraced the idea of Jewish immigration, and that was the Dominican Republic. And this was a little bit of a surprise. As we will see in just a minute, the Dominican Republic was then under the rule of Rafael Trujillo, in every way a brutal dictator and a proponent of genocide himself, who was allowing up to 100,000 Jews to arrive in the Dominican Republic. Why? So that's a question I'm going to return back to. But it's startling that at the AVN conference, when the doors of the world were closed, the Dominican Republic, of all countries, opened their doors. just to kind of appreciate, before we get into the Caribbean, just to appreciate the psychological effect of the failure of the Bermuda Conference. And remember that the Bermuda Conference was taking place as the Holocaust was beginning. In fact, it was the same exact time as the Warsaw Uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And you really feel the psychological devastation wrought by the Bermuda Conference and the failures of the Bermuda Conference, when the delegate to the Bermuda Conference representing the Polish exiled government in London, who is the Jew Shmuel Ziegelboim, who committed suicide when he learned that his wife and his son had been killed in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And to the dissonance of what was happening in Warsaw and the knowledge of what was happening in Poland, compared to the somewhat indifference that was, from his perspective, being demonstrated in Bermuda, was enough to cause him to commit suicide in a kind of performative way in order to make a point of how psychologically brutalized the Jewish people have become. So he wrote, before he committed suicide, and I will quote him here, "I cannot continue to live and to be silent while the remnants of Polish Jewry, whose representative I am, are being murdered. My comrades in the Warsaw Ghetto fell with arms in their hands in the last heroic battle. I was not permitted to fall like them, together with them, but I belong with them to their mass grave. By my death, I wish to give expression to my most profound protest against the inaction in which the world watches and permits the destruction of the Jewish people." I just feel like that's a very powerful way of being able to conceive of the impact of the inaction of the world to open the doors to refugees. Here you see a map that I took from the United States Holocaust Museum, which so generously supplied by them, and you get a good sense here of the weight of the different paths of migration out of Europe. So and what we'll really be focusing on today is not so much South America, but the Caribbean, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Trinidad, and Jamaica. So we're not talking about a whole lot of people. So maybe 21,000 people at the most, and those are transients, not settlers. So it's important to kind of consider all of this and to help to visualize the paths of migration between 1933 and 1940. So this is a familiar story, and John alluded to it earlier, is the voyage, the damned voyage of the St. Louis, which was this is a familiar story, but I think I want to kind of provide the Caribbean context for this, because the St. Louis, carrying over 900 Jewish refugees in 1939, sailed from Hamburg, and the destination was Cuba. And almost all of them had landing papers in Cuba. Now, the Cuban government will argue that those had been acquired by people who are, unreputable sources. And so disreputable sources, and therefore the landing papers weren't valid. And so that will be the main argument of why those that have landing papers aren't going to be allowed to settle in Cuba. And we all know the story, it was turned away. So what was going on in Cuba around the time that the St. Louis showed up with these Jewish refugees? At the time, there had been a populist anti-immigration movement that had really taken hold since the start of the war. And this was coming from a lot of different places. Cubans were worried that South American governments were trying to assert dominance in the region. They were obviously very worried about Black migration from the Caribbean, from other parts of the Caribbean. So this gave rise to a populist anti-immigrant movement in Cuba. And also its response to the fact that already thousands of Jews were settled in Cuba at the time that the St. Louis emerged. When the St. Louis got there were lots of Jews settled in Cuba and refugees. So the former president of Cuba at the time, Ramon Grau, he didn't actually lead this movement, but his followers did. He was sort of a figurehead of the anti-immigrant movement. And one of his spokesmen is quoted as saying, "Fight the Jews until the last one is driven out." And so that's a very profound sentiment that's in place in Cuba at the time that the St. Louis arrives, and helps us to contextualize a little bit why it was turned away. Now, the JDC tried to negotiate for those to land. The current president of Cuba at the time, Federico Bru, tried to extort the JDC. He asked for, I think it's something like maybe $5,000 for each immigrant that they would settle. So there was an extortion attempt. The JDC simply couldn't support that. So in the end, even though a couple refugees from the St. Louis were landed in Cuba, the vast majority of them were turned away, and they sailed to Miami, hoping to gain entry into the United States, where they wired directly to the president's office to ask for amnesty, to call for a humanitarian response, and the doors were closed. And you all know the end of the story. The St. Louis was sent back to Europe. It landed in Western Europe, where people were settled in England and also in the Netherlands. And as the Nazi regime expands through Vichy France and into the Netherlands, those people are then sent to camps. And so at least 200 of the refugees we know for sure that were on the St. Louis were later killed in the Holocaust. So I mean, and that is what's at stake in all of this. What's at stake in the refugee crisis is, not that they're going to be landed in refugee camps, but they're going to be landed in concentration camps. And so this is the great fear and the reality of what's at stake. Okay, so now let's get more into the Caribbean itself, and let's talk about Cuba since we were there. One point that I'll make is that the St. Louis is not a one-off. Okay, St. Louis was really just representative of a lot of experiences. There were several other attempts, at least 3 other attempts to land in Cuba, in which a small minority of the refugees were landed and the others were sent on. A good example of that is the Orduña, which is a ship that sailed to land Jewish refugees in Cuba in 1939. Shortly after the St. Louis, about 48 were landed in Cuba, and the rest the JDC had to pay to send them through the Panama Canal and around where they settled, I think, in British Honduras. And so this helps us to understand that the St. Louis wasn't a unique example. It was representative in a lot of ways of other experiences on board refugee ships. That said, a lot of Jewish refugees did resettle in Cuba. Those that had legitimate landing papers, those that were already settled in Cuba. And so by 1944, there were about 12,000 Jews estimated to live in Cuba. This was the time during the war, an anti-fascist government supported by the United States. Even though he had the support of communists, he later on disabused them, and that is the government of Batista. And that's helpful to understand why, in some ways, the Cubans were open, to some extent, to Jewish migration, at least Batista, because of support of the Allied cause as a performance of defiance of fascism. Now, Cuba had internment camps, though. If you were alien enemies, right? So now Cuba is allied with the United States under Batista. So as an ally to the United States, they are required to inter anyone who's considered to be an enemy alien. So anyone basically with a German passport or an Austrian passport, which includes the most Jewish refugees that are trying to land in Cuba. So many of them are become internees in a displacement camp and in an internment camp that was on a very large island in the southern part of Cuba that at the time was called the Isla de Pinos, which is the island of pines. But now, I think in 1970s, the island was changed to the Isla de Juventud, which is the island of youth. So there was a major internment camp, and you had to reside there for sometimes months to more than a year until you could be relocated in Cuba. Now, once you were relocated within the borders of Cuba, where were you going to go? There weren't very many places open. The part of the resistance to Jewish immigration at the time that you saw being advocated by people like Ramon Grau was because of more reliance on American tourism, right? The Hotel Cuba, as it's called, Hotel Havana, where which even in the 1930s had become a major port of tourism for the United States. And part of the fear is that bringing in a Jewish rabble from Europe is going to discourage the white Protestant Americans from wanting to vacation in Havana. And that's a sentiment that's relatively widespread in Cuba at the time. And so Havana's kind of off limits. So where do they go? So there are agricultural settlements that are established. In fact, the American Friends Service, which is an allied refugee placement service, helps to establish an agricultural settlement at Paso Seco. So Finca Paso Seco, the farm of the Paso Seco family. It was established by it was leased by the American Friends Service in 1938, and several hundred people ended up in this place. Now, it wasn't a very productive agricultural settlement. Mostly there's one account that says mostly what was being harvested was dirt. And so it was, and also part of the conflict of settling refugees in the Caribbean is that many, and certainly most, I would say, of the refugees that are coming from Germany and Austria don't have any agricultural experience. Typically speaking, Jews in German lands at the time of World War II were relatively well-heeled. They were relatively urban. They were mostly found in professional type of avocations. So a lot of physicians and lawyers and retailers and things like that. Very few people with actual agricultural experience, which plays a big role, as you know, in the Yishuv in Palestine. The fact that there was a lack of agricultural knowledge, but it also is very much at play in the Caribbean. Here's some images from the JDC website that really capture Jewish life in Cuba. So here you see the farming mentality, the expectation that Jews are going to contribute to the agricultural health of the island. You see this sense of community that emerges, and here you see the labor, right? I think that they're making shoes. I'm not 100% sure about that. I don't know. Maybe someone else knows what they're doing. I'm not exactly sure what they're making, but they're working in an industrial setting in a factory, and and it's very. I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of those men had never worked in a factory before. So this was a real shock to what was the vocational expectations of refugees who are settling in the Caribbean. Now let's talk about the Dominican Republic. So I mentioned before that at the Avian Conference, the Dominican Republic, the representative of the Dominican Republic on orders from Rafael Trujillo, agreed to settle 10,000 refugees in the Dominican Republic. Now, no more than 3,000 actually passed through, and there's various reasons for this. Just the nature of the the nature of the paths of migration, the fact that the Dominican Republic wasn't a great landing point in order to get you to the United States, which is what the goal is, or to Argentina or parts of South America, Panama. And so in the end, not a lot of Jews took advantage or were able to take advantage of the offer made by Trujillo at the Avian Conference. And now let's try to figure out why it is that Trujillo would make such an offer. Why, when all the other doors of the world were shut, did Trujillo open the doors to Jewish migration in the Caribbean? And so Marianne Kaplan, who I'm very much indebted to for providing research in this area, who wrote an amazing book called Dominican Haven, in which she really dug into the archive. She's an expert in the Holocaust and in the social death of Jews in the 1930s. And she argues that it really had nothing to do with Jews per se, but it had to do with an anti-Haitianismo, like a sense of anti-Haitianism that was prevalent in Trujillo's policy. So that is to say, an attempt to blanch the settlement of the Dominican Republic. He was himself a perpetrator of genocide. In 1937, and 1 year before the Avian Conference, when they agreed to take Jews, Trujillo had given the orders to the Dominican military to massacre Black Haitians, and thousands of Haitians were killed brutally. And by brutally, I mean killed with like machetes, not by firing squad, but massacred. And some estimates are as many as 20,000 Haitians killed in the course of a week or so, and the massacre that's known broadly as the Massacre de Perejil, which is the parsley massacres. And the reason it's called that is because apparently the French patois, French Creole way of pronouncing parsley was very distinct from the way the Spanish did, and so they would show them this and say, what is this? Showing them parsley, and they would massacre you based on how you pronounced it. Now that's kind of a fictitious thing. The bottom line, you were massacred if you were Black. Trujillo wanted to see the Dominican Republic become white. So having migration of Jews and trying to infuse the island with European migrants was part of his own plans of genocide. So there's a big irony in all of this. How ethnic cleansing in one context benefits those that are being ethnically cleansed from another context. And sometimes this is the contradictory and paradoxical elements of genocide. And so in this case, the Jews were beneficiaries of the fact that Black people were being massacred by Trujillo at the same time. So that's why they were probably allowed into the Dominican Republic. Now, very few actually went. The Dominican Republic, the JDC branch in the Dominican Republic establishes a landed, internal, localized relief agency known as the Dominican Republic Settlement Association, or DORSA. And they were there to try to provide housing and to provide the basic necessities of resettlement in the Dominican Republic. And so the one place that really does emerge as a Jewish haven is Sosua, an agricultural settlement on the northeast coast of Cuba. And today, Sosua, I think, is kind of a resort town. People go. I've heard people have traveled there, and I haven't been there myself. But here, the same kind of tensions that were at play in Cuba were very much at play in the Dominican Republic. Of the 500 to 700 people that resided in Sosua among the German immigrants had no knowledge of agriculture, and they were being asked to produce dairy. They were canning tomatoes. Here you'll see that they had a large sausage factory, and so you see that here. And so again, these are people with very little knowledge of agriculture that are really being placed out of their element. They are fishes out of water. So here you can kind of get a sense of the labor expectations. Here you see they're plowing with oxen. Here, I'm sure no one was plowing with oxen in German lands probably in the 1930s, and keeping of chickens and geese. And then this is a great image here in the sense that you see the continuity of Jewish cultural life as it's playing out in Sasua. Now, very few Jews actually stay. The Jewish immigrants in Sasua are using it as a port to try to immigrate to the United States, hopefully. And so very few stay. The ones that stay are the ones that intermarry with Dominican women, usually women. Usually, in most cases, it's the Jewish men who marry Dominican women, and they stay and have a presence. But there's very few of those. Most of them leave after the war. Let's talk about now the British Caribbean, and particularly, let's start with Jamaica. So first of all, let's try to understand what's happening in the British government surrounding the refugee crisis. Obviously, there's a big demand, and there's pressure on the colonial office of Britain to open up the British West Indies to Jewish migration and open up every part of the British Empire to migration. They want people are pressuring the British to open up ports in Kenya and Uganda, as well as parts of the Americas. And wherever the British are, they are calling for the permissibility of Jewish settlement. So there are a number of these West Indian settlement schemes. Now, Chaim Weizmann calls these all kind of fleeting experiments in settlement, and nothing will ever actually work, because only place that can work would be Mandate Palestine, to Weizmann's perspective. But one of the reasons that the British Colonial Office and the Foreign Office that were mediating these demands were very reluctant to actually open up British Guiana, or to open up Trinidad, or to open up Jamaica or Barbados to migration, was because they were dealing with their own internal issues at the time. There had been major labor upheavals in the British West Indies in the early part of the 20th century. Jamaica had seen tremendous street rioting in the time of World War I, immediately after World War I, in the interwar periods, rise in Black nationalism, calling for the removal of imperial structures. And so the British were being criticized for allowing their West Indian possessions for falling into poverty and penury. So this was what informed the Colonial Office to issue the Moyne Commission, in which they pledged to invest more heavily in indigenous labor. Part of the problem was there were so many immigrants from India that were coming at the counterflows of colonialism that were coming from British India, settling there, which upset Black nationalist groups that wanted to protect the labor pool in the Caribbean. So because the British had committed to investing more in indigenous labor in the Caribbean, they couldn't just then turn around and admit Jewish refugees in the Caribbean. So they established first an internment policy. They are, of course, part of the Allies, and so anyone with a German or Austrian passport is naturally considered to be an enemy alien. And so the Jamaican Colonial Office establishes 2 internment camps before the main wave of migrations in 1939. So the internment policy looked like this. There was the one place for men called Up Park Camp, and then another in the middle of the city in Kingston of Hanover Street Camp, and that was for women. Now, the camp for men, Up Park Camp, had very few Jews. We're talking maybe 12 to 14 Jews. So it really wasn't focused exclusively on Jews. It was many more people who were non-Jewish with German passports. But it was relatively open and free to move around. That was not the case at Hanover Street Camp for Women, which was was basically a prison. It was surrounded in barbed wire. It was in Kingston's red light district, so it was kind of an insult to. And here there were many more Jewish women. So this was a situation. Now, at the time, the Jamaicans were hastily building Gibraltar Camp on the site that is today the Mona Heights campus of UWI, of the University of West Indies. So I've been there a whole bunch of times, and so they have plaques there remembering the fact that there was a displacement camp at the site of the university today in Mona Heights in Kingston. Now, initially the camp was being built because the British were trying to evacuate the civilian population from Gibraltar, which would have been a British holding for centuries. The fear was that naturally the Axis powers are going to take Gibraltar, and they needed to protect the civilian population. So first they tried to relocate the civilian population of Gibraltar to French Morocco. Then when the Nazi regime occupies France, they can't stay there, so they have to go back to Gibraltar. There they're relocated to England. England refuses to accept these Gibraltar refugees, and so they call on the Jamaicans to very quickly build a camp that could sustain the displaced populations from Gibraltar. Now, they grossly underestimated how many refugees they needed. So in the middle of construction, they say that they had to build capacity for 5,000 more refugees. And so Gibraltar camp was a work in progress always. It was always being added to. In the end, it was actually, there was more space than was needed. And this is interesting because of the British unwillingness to settle migrants in England, but they were willing to shovel out millions to build the Gibraltar camp and keep on adding to it. So there's sort of a discontinuity in the logic of the policy here. Now, the Gibraltar camp at its height maybe had 13,000 refugees, but had very few Jamaican employees. So for about 450,000 internees, in 1940, there were only 195 Jamaican employees. So it was understaffed, and it was strangely cut off from the world. It was, these were people that were not enemy aliens, right? These were British civil citizens that were displaced from Gibraltar. So it was because of that, there was a relatively, at least in theory, open door policy. And so some Gibraltar internees were able to come and go, but it was completely closed off to Jamaicans. There was one interesting case when a Jamaican fruit seller was coming to the wired fence of Gibraltar camp trying to sell fruit, and he was put on trial and was incarcerated for that, because it was illegal to have interaction in the camp. So you could leave the camp and come back, but you couldn't, but a Jamaican couldn't mingle with anybody inside the camp. So there was almost no exchange of cultural exchange between Jewish and German and other internees at the Gibraltar camp and local Jamaicans. And that's interesting. It's different than the Dominican Republic, where at least some did marry Dominican women and stay put and grow families there. And Jamaica, there was very little interaction, and almost nobody stays after the war. Now, I'm running short on time, and so I just want to talk quickly about Trinidad. But here you see Gibraltar Camp and the sprawling Mona Heights plantation, the Mona Plantation. And it looks basically like this today at the campus of UWI. And again, also these kind of laborers, here they are making dresses, textile manufacturing, and Gibraltar Camp. Now, quickly, I want to talk about Trinidad. Now, Trinidad was naturally the place that everyone wanted to go. Trinidad was the first destination of immigrants' interest because it didn't require visas, right? You just needed a passport. And so Trinidad was naturally a place that would take refugees. And so very early on, the JDC branch in Trinidad established a JAT, a Jewish Association of Trinidad. And this was led by a Jew that was already living there named Edgar Pereira, who had been probably from a Jamaican family or a Curacao family, old family of Portuguese Jews settled in the Caribbean, who had relocated to Panama at the time of in the early 20th century, when most of the earlier settlements of Jews in the Caribbean relocated to Latin America. And then he came to Trinidad. And so he was a major player because he was indigenized. He was a local agent that could help to relocate and settle displaced people in Trinidad. So so Jews were pouring into Trinidad because, right, no visa requirements. Let's go. And it has a very well established aid agencies. So the Trinidadian colonial government realizes that this is an issue, and so they debate placing more immigration bans, and they succeed in doing that in 1939. So after 1939, the door closes somewhat, and the bans continue to get more harsh as they go and as the war proceeds. The Trinidad Guardian calls for these bans. Part of the fear here is the fear of neocolonialism. You're going to reintroduce a white population, and a lot of the Jews in Trinidad before the refugee crisis were pretty wealthy, known to be wealthy retailers. The man that you see here, the Tauscher family, he was, a watch seller in Port of Spain in Trinidad. So there had been a well-established kind of Jewish presence there already. And so the fear was by bringing more white people into Trinidad, you're going to displace the labor that's available to indigenous Black Trinidadians. That is going to create competition in the economy. And even Marcus Garvey from Harlem delivers a speech at this time where he warns of the reintroduction of white colonial elements back into the recently decolonized or aspirationally decolonized Caribbean. And so internment camps are established in Trinidad, especially Camp Rented. At Camp Rented, the Jews are segregated. So there is a Jewish block and there is a non-Jewish block. And that says a lot about the perceptions of Jews here and the real fear that the immigrants that are coming to take away jobs and to create competition, labor competition, were Jews. So I'm out of time, but I just wanted to address the kind of perception of what it means to have Jews in the Caribbean at the time. So in Trinidad in the 1930s, perhaps the most profound avenue of social satire and political commentary and also just humor came in the form of calypsos. So I don't know if a lot of you have heard calypsos, but they're often very funny. They're kind of very jovial sounding music, and they very much sound like Cuban music to some extent. But they are very literary. They are very lyrical. Calypsos have multiple verses, right, which becomes a point of social commentary. For instance, Attila the Hun, they all have these names like that. The Calypsonian Attila the Hun writes a very long calypso about FDR's arrival in Trinidad. Now, there were multiple calypsos that were composed in response to the Jewish immigration in the Caribbean. And some of them were more favorable, and some of them were more ambivalent, like this one. So one of the most famous calypsonians, King Radio, wrote a calypso called The Jews' Immigration. Now, unfortunately, these weren't recorded, and that was because they were censored by the Trinidadian colonial government. But we do have the texts of the lyrical poems. And so I'm just going to read this, and I will close with, after reading the calypso, written by King Radio, who is, that's the stage name of Norman Spann, who you see here, and the only image I could find. And I'll try my best to read it in the rhyme scheme, but I can't do justice without the music, of course. So he writes, we form no objection with the Jew immigration, but we want representation. But we all had agreed and received a few, but to come in by the thousand, that wouldn't do in the ages of humanity. Trinidad is a cosmopolitan little island in the West, and it is considered to be the best. The foreigners leaving all their homes, and here they look to run, like Trinidad is the dumping ground. The place is so congested, friends, I must say, yet the foreigners are pouring in every day. So I disagree. That shouldn't be in a small little colony. Now they got trouble with the Jews. The fact I must put to you. Needn't my friends doubt it if they know it's true? They are going to form an opposition with every single merchant as to run them competition. Any part of town you see a Jew store, bet your life he is selling cheap to the rich and to the poor. It is plain to see. So thank you very much for your attention and for including me in this very important conference. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to present this material to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mirvis. That was really very informative, and I'm glad we recorded it because there was a lot of information there. We do have a question here from a colleague of yours, from Tim Langille, who says, the Dominican Republic looks courageous and heroic in the history of the Avion Conference and the voyage of the St. Louis. But the Dominican Republic had just perpetrated the Parsley massacre of Haitians in October 1937. Could you speak to these two intersecting histories? Perhaps this is, okay. Could you speak to those, please?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'm glad that Tim was here to help me out with a question. Here, so the I think that this is the paradox sometimes of when you're talking about ethnic cleansing in general. So as the one genocide is on the heels of another genocide, or there is an entanglement between two separate genocides. The anti-Haitianismo of policy of Trujillo to blanch the society of Dominican Republic results in actual murder of thousands of people who are, and it's not because they're speaking Haitian Creole, it's because they're Black. And so this is an attempt to create a more white society from the perspective of Trujillo. To this very day, there's a real colorist ethos within the Dominican Republic, and that hasn't gone away. Now, that particular ethnic cleansing and that genocide, and I don't know if that qualifies, but let's say, I think you can call it a genocide. Trujillo was trying to eradicate Haitian, and by Haitian, he meant Black population of the Dominican Republic. But this worked to the advantage of the perceived to be white European German Jews who were being granted access as an attempt to whiten the place. So this is I appreciate, Tim, that the contradiction in all this. It's paradoxical that one refugee group can benefit from the tragedy of another refugee and displaced group. But that's sometimes the paradox of genocide. I wish I had more insight into this, other than just appreciating how bizarre it is.
Okay. So there's someone who wanted to know about where, because there were people in the DR that where they were seemed to be a little more welcome there in the DR. So did anyone elect to stay? And if so, what are the numbers today with regards to the Jewish community in the Caribbean?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. So Marian Capel does a good job of trying to trace in her book Dominican Haven, trying to trace who remained, and very few did. And typically speaking, not in every case, but typically speaking, those that did stay in the DR were men who married Dominican women. And very infrequently, in only a very few cases, was it the opposite, Jewish women who married Dominican men, but it happened, of course. And so this is the population that stays. But because the mothers were Catholic, usually, as most Dominicans are, not all, there's obviously Seventh-day Adventism and other, religious expressions in the Dominican Republic. But the overwhelming majority of people in the DR are Catholic. And so, because of that, very few of them continue to have a Jewish identity. So in the Dominican Republic today, there really isn't a Jewish community. Now, there are but Dominican Republic is a very extensive tourist industry, which brings lots of Jews. So at any given time, there may be thousands of Jews in the Dominican Republic, but they don't live there. But generally speaking, in the Caribbean, there's really only two islands anymore that have an active Jewish community, and that is Jamaica and Curacao.
Okay, and we have a comment and a question from Janice Freebaum. Fabulous presentation, Professor Mirvis. Thank you. How do these Caribbean nations view this part of their history today? How would they evaluate their efforts to preserve and interpret this part of their national histories?
Well, that's a really good question, and I don't have a full answer to that, but I will say that there's a let me try to answer it by like an indirect way, a place that we didn't even talk about, Suriname. And Suriname had a very big, robust population of Jews in the 18th century. Beginning in the 17th century, 18th century, Portuguese Jews that had all re-Judaized, that they had all been conversos, and they established themselves as open Jews, and they settled in Suriname, in Jordan Savannah, in the jungle, but also in the merchant capital of Paramaribo. And so there was a very big, robust community. And in the 70s, as Suriname is beginning to assert itself as an independent community, as it goes through the process of decolonization, it tries to reach back into its past in order to claim what are the things that make it distinct from the Netherlands in which they are asserting their independence. And one of those things was the welcomeness of Jews and having this Jewish community. And they look at Jewish communities as a part of its colonial past that was something that helped to inform its independent character from that of the Netherlands. And so they issued these very fascinating stamps. In fact, by the way, those stamps, I have those stamps, and I gave them to the I lent them, I should say, to the Arizona Jewish Historical Society. So they're there right now, currently on display, and you can go see those stamps. But that's a good example of how, as part of decolonization, they look back to the Jewish presence as a way of informing who they are, or describing who they are as a Caribbean nation. And so that's just by way of illustration, because the same goes for the response in World War II. A place like Dominican Republic obviously champions the fact that they were a port of haven. And they also do it by way of trying to deflect, from the fact that there was this was an answer to their own genocide. So of course there's an attempt to try to assert the positives and try to diminish their own participation in genocide in terms of the Dominican Republic. Now in Jamaica, Gibraltar Camp is now it's something that the Jamaican government has made an effort to remember. So at the University of West Indies, they put a plaque there in order to remember. Now and it's grown in. I haven't seen it in a really long time, but it's grown into a whole display unto itself. So there's a real effort to try to stake a claim and remember the presence of Jews in this particular moment. And it's also become the subject of a great deal of scholarship. Diana Cooper Clark and Joanna Newman have all been writing about Gibraltar Camp, and there's been a lot of interviews with internees at the Gibraltar Camp. So I'd say if there's one response, unified response, there is an effort today to try to resurrect this particular part of Caribbean history and to draw attention to it.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mirvis. We're out of time now, but we do have a very important message to announce to everyone, and we have one of your colleagues here, Dr. Hava Samuelson to announce this.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you very much, Stanley, for indeed fabulous lecture, very detailed and informative. I've learned an awful lot of material that I did not know before. So I would like to thank all of you for participating in the Genocide Awareness Week this year. And what we are going to tell you, probably most of you already know, that in 2022, Genocide Awareness Week will be moving to Arizona State University and will become a joint project with Northern Arizona University and the University of Arizona. And we hope to see you all in April 22 as we continue our commitment to education about the Holocaust and other genocides. So thank you for your interest and support,